Have you ever created a masterpiece? Well, I just did, in the bathroom 5 minutes before I started this recording. All jokes aside, I just saw Dune Part 2, and it was really so amazing that I just wanted to talk about it. The first thing I'd like to talk about is why you should see it. Someone who I think put it into words beautifully was Hideo Kojima. I believe he posted on his Twitter, and he, in short, was basically saying that he feels that Dune Part 2, released in theaters, is something that's heavily going to delay people watching movies on their TVs at the home. And the reason being is because when I was watching Dune Part 2, it genuinely felt like I was a part of cinema history. There were some extremely amazing and profound moments in the movie that at the end of the day you would just not experience at home. And you know what? Maybe you haven't seen Dune Part 2 yet, maybe you have. Regardless, I'd like to do a quick recap of Dune Part 1. So in short, in the first Dune movie, you have multiple houses like House Atreides and House Harkonnen. So this man, the Duke Leto Atreides, is assigned to the planet Arrakis. And the reason Arrakis is an important planet in the movie is while it is a desert planet, it has this extremely valuable resource called spice. While it does do things like induces hallucinations, it also heightens vitality and awareness, and it's also a significant power source. It powers interstellar travel. So now that I've painted a little bit of the picture, Leto Atreides and his family go to Arrakis, and they are suspicious of this emperor who has decided they're going to go to the planet and they are going to take control of the planet because Baron Harkonnen was the one who was in control of the planet. So having suspicions, Leto Atreides makes an alliance with the natives of Arrakis, who are called the Fremen. There are a lot of themes and motifs in this movie, and the way that they are expressed in the movie are really beautiful and amazing. You have two sides of the spectrum. There's a lot of duality in the movie, which I'm going to talk about more, which I thought was really amazing. The writing was fantastic. It seemed true to the books, even though I don't have a lot of knowledge on them. But you have the planet Arrakis with its natural resource called spice. And the natives have found a way to coexist with the spice and naturally and healthily be one with the nature of their planet. Then you have these houses who are all fighting for control of power and energy. And they're not trying to be one with nature, they're trying to control nature. And I think the blue eyes of the Fremen is something that exemplifies this in a really great way. So keep in mind, there's a lot of themes and motifs that are tackled in this movie, all about duality. I don't want to linger too much on Dune Part 1, but in short, we find out that Leto Atreides, who is the Duke, he has a son with someone who he's not married to, who is Lady Jessica. His name is Paul. Now, the reason that he's not married to Lady Jessica is because it would cause chaos in the different houses, Harkonnen, Atreides, and so forth. And again, here's another theme and motif that's tackled, is the duality in the movie, which is shown really well from Part 1 to Part 2. And what I mean by that is that Leto Atreides decided and intentionally chose to choose for the greater good rather than his love for Lady Jessica. So anyways, in short, it turns out that Lady Jessica is actually a member of the Bene Gesserits. In short, it's like a sisterhood, and they push themselves to have physical and mental and spiritual powers. They essentially do like a century-long breeding in an effort to push humanity to a point where they would create a human being who would be this like messiah figure with fantastic mental and physical powers, who would be able to lead humanity to the greater good. Again, another way of tackling the topic of choosing between love, choosing between what you want, and choosing between that and the greater good. The Atreides family, they go to Arrakis. Essentially, the Harkonnens, they attack. Paul's father is killed. Paul and his mom, Lady Jessica, are planned to be killed, but we find out that Paul has actually been trained in the ways of the Bene Gesserits, which actually is this form of heresy. It's only supposed to be a sisterhood. And this is where Part 2 begins. Paul and Lady Jessica survive the attack, and they take refuge with the Fremen. Essentially, what has happened, Paul discovers that Lady Jessica, his mother, and the Bene Gesserit's sisterhood have been spreading a prophecy to the native people, the Fremen, on Arrakis. So there's a lot of people who begin to believe that Paul is this messiah figure. Now, at first, Paul has rejected that. He thinks it's ridiculous. He's angry with his mother. He wants the prophecies that are being spread to put to a stop. And this is where Dune did something really well that I haven't seen done well in movies in a long time. Comic relief. There's a Southern Fremen character named Stilgar, and he truly believes in Paul and the prophecies. So Stilgar is a serious character who I can take seriously. But there are some really funny moments that break tension. Like, for example, Paul is so humble and so rejecting of the prophecies of what the natives would call the Messiah, lisan al-gaib, that the movie quickly cuts to a scene with Stilgar talking to other Fremen, eyes wide open and eager, telling them he must be the lisan al-gaib because the lisan al-gaib would be too humble to take credit and admit he's the one. Yeah, and it was just refreshing to have some comic relief, but the writers didn't allow it to completely ruin the character, making himself into a big fool and just becoming downright irritating. It was refreshing. This movie was different and it was refreshing. And yet still, Paul could sit there and go, whoa, and we could still chuckle at the fact that Stilgar would go, the lisan al-gaib. And again, here's more duality. Northern natives to Arrakis, the Fremen, they reject this prophecy. They want their own freedom and they don't want to have a messiah to push away the houses from constantly fighting over spice and their planet. And then you have the Southern Fremen, who are in this case considered the fundamentalists. And they are the people who fully believe in the prophecy, and they have 100% been indoctrinated by Lady Jessica and the Bene Gesserits. I didn't know anything about Dune going into this. There were really so many profound themes and topics that were tackled in this movie. So themes of choosing between one life and the masses, tackling concepts of what is free will. Do we have free will? Is a prophecy real? Can we escape fate? And in part 2, I want to talk about some of the duality that I thought was just really amazing, very profound and very beautiful. Paul slowly joins the Fremen, and while he is in denial of the prophecy, he feels that he has found his people. And slowly over time, Paul is actually doing everything that are in the prophecies. So one of the things that he does do is he learns to ride a sandworm. And honestly, I gotta say, that scene was so amazing. And that was a test to see, will Paul officially be a member, not by blood, but a member of the Fremen. And Paul calls a sandworm that is so ginormous, bigger than anyone has ever called and ridden. I should have done spoiler warning. Without providing too many details, the tension in that scene, when I tell you that I was sweating. And at that point in the movie, you can see that there's a real turning point with Paul. The people believe so much in him and they're so excited for him that everyone ends up believing in the prophecy. But at the same time, you can see that Paul has this internal struggle where he believes in himself that if he joins the Fremen, they can fight the houses and they can fight the people who are coming to steal spice and control the planet. But he knows that as people believe more in him, and if he goes south to the fundamentalists, the visions that he's having, the self-fulfilled prophecy of him destroying everything around him will come true. So again, this is just more topics of choosing between what you want and what you think is right, and choosing between what you know you have to do to save the masses. So Paul doesn't want to die. He's also falling for this girl, Chani. He doesn't want her to die. But gradually, there's more and more tension in the movie where he truly feels, okay, it's gonna come to a point where I have to pick between myself, my love for Chani and her love for me, or I'm gonna have to pick between freedom for this planet and my love for the people, the Fremen as a whole. And what I thought was so profound is that at the beginning of the movie, he takes off his house ring that his dad gave him. And in part 1, his dad said, you know what, when I was your age, I didn't want to wear the ring either. I said the same thing to your grandfather. But later in part 2, Paul has a turning point where he realizes he puts the ring back on. That's what I thought was so beautiful about the parallels between part 1 and part 2. The same decision that Duke Leto Atreides made, where he loved Jessica so much, but he didn't marry her because he knew that he would cause chaos for the masses if he married her, even though he loves her. He chose to prioritize everyone over his love for one person and himself. And Paul was put in the same situation. Towards the end of the movie, we find out that Paul is put in a situation where this was very profound. He looks at Chani and he says, I want you to know for as long as I breathe, I will always love you. And he himself decides to pick the masses and prioritize the masses and the greater good over his love for one person and what his selfish needs are. So that was just some things about Dune Part 2 that I found were extremely profound. I also thought that the soundtrack was so amazing. It wasn't standing out, but it was so complimentary and perfectly in the background where you just barely notice it, and it works so well in every scene. Two of the biggest moments where I felt that the soundtrack really worked well, where essentially there is this lunatic, his name is Fade, and it comes to a point where the Bene Gesserits are basically saying, okay, listen, Paul is out of control. We need someone to control so that we can continue this prophecy and, for the greater good and controlling the masses and having our Messiah. So they pick this lunatic, Fade. And there's more I want to talk about with him. But onto the soundtrack, there is a moment in the movie where Paul and Fade are fighting, and the tension is so palpable. Like I said, I was sweating because there was no soundtrack. For a good few minutes, it is just the sounds of them fighting. And it's moments like these where I realized that the director of the movie had said in interviews that this movie is a passion project. The pacing is beautiful. It's not too slow, but it's paced just enough where it was a 2.5 movie and it flew by. I just said it was a 2.5 movie. It was a 2.5 hour movie and it truly flew by. So I, for one, really appreciated that it was nice and slow, it was paced perfectly, and it wasn't one of these like Hollywood blockbusters that are boom, 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 boom. And that's especially refreshing because for years we were just locked into Marvel, and while everyone did enjoy it, it was just too fast. And the second moment I wanted to talk about with the soundtrack was actually right after the complete lack of soundtrack. You basically have this moment where Paul, right after he talks to Chani and he says, as long as I will breathe, I will love you. He goes up to the emperor's daughter and basically says, I'm going to become the emperor and you're going to become my queen. And in that moment, that is when the lack of soundtrack disappears and immediately this one track hits and you get the chills because all in that moment you feel what Chani has felt. Betrayal and hurt. So there's this scene where Chani basically runs off and she's extremely hurt. In that moment, she's not able to see. She feels that Paul has been too caught up in the prophecies and he's not choosing his love for her. But what she doesn't see is that he loves her so much that he's choosing the greater good, the good of the Fremen, to make these decisions. Exactly the situation that his father had to be in. So another thing I wanted to talk about, just going back to that guy, the lunatic, the person who acted that character did a fantastic job. I mean, I truly felt, honestly, it was probably what Jared Leto was trying to do with the Joker. So the person who played Fade did such a good job at portraying just a true lunatic. On that topic, the Bene Gesserits are actually testing him. That's another thing about this movie. Everything is all about what can be controlled. So you have this base level, prophecies and fate, but on the deeper level, we learn that really what's going on is it's all about control. So in a moment where the Bene Gesserits are trying to determine, can we control Fade, what ends up happening is that one of the Bene Gesserits approaches him and essentially seduces him, testing him to see, can he be controlled? What is his mental state? One thing that I thought was very profound is that the Bene Gesserits use sex as a means of control. They use their bodies as a means of control. They bear children for the sake of the greater good and continuing this like century-long breeding process of creating this Messiah. And in that moment when one of the Bene Gesserits is manipulating Fade and she is going to seduce him and basically bear his child, they enter a room that is more circular in shape and essentially is resembling that of a vagina. It's open, it's welcoming, it's receiving. As weird as it is to talk about that, I just thought that whoever was in charge of the cinematography, it was such a profound work. It was really, really amazing. The imagery and casting was just so intentional. Like, for example, when we're first shown the Emperor, he's seen playing chess. I have to believe that was intentional. Showing that he is just a pawn, because it turns out he is. He is just a piece on the board that the Bene Gesserits are playing. Another detail that's so intentional, Christopher Walken was the Emperor. And saying that, you might go, what? Isn't he the goofy chill guy from Click who sells the Universal Remote to Adam Sandler? But he played the part perfectly, being himself because he is an emperor in name only. The sisterhood is in control here. There was one more moment too when it came to imagery that I thought was really amazing. The whole nature of the Fremen is that they're one with the planet and they're one with nature. And that's the way that they fight, is they're underground, and then when they're fighting people like the Harkonnen who are trying to harvest the spice, they come out of nowhere and attack. They were not in plain sight, and just like that they are, because they're one with nature. And there was one scene where the Emperor comes down to Arrakis. Paul is leading the Fremen and they're going to attack the Emperor. They're going to attack the Baron, they're going to attack the Bene Gesserits and all that stuff. What ends up happening is that they shoot missiles, and there's this huge dust cloud from the missiles that they shoot. And in the dust cloud, this shot of them riding, the Fremen and Paul riding sandworms emerging from the dust cloud, not only was so resemblant of the way that they are so one with nature, and it really was just like a breathtaking shot. In that moment, I was thinking to myself, like, I am living in cinema history. This is a moment when I'm 70, I'm going to look back and I'm going to go, damn. The one last thing that I do want to talk about was a bit of a plot twist. And now, this is a major spoiler, so if you don't want to hear it, stop watching the video. So what that plot twist was actually that Paul, who he thought he was an Atreides, right? We end up finding out that Paul's mother, Lady Jessica, is actually the daughter of Baron Harkonnen. So it turns out that Paul is like this mixed blood mutt, where he's an Atreides, but he's also technically a Harkonnen. And I'm gonna be honest, the way that they revealed that was actually just such a dull, like, tap, you know, like a tap on the wrist. I don't know how true this is, but I did hear from a friend that George Lucas was heavily inspired by Dune when he created Star Wars. And in Star Wars, the plot twist about family connections was so much more profound. So if that is true, I can see why George Lucas did that, because what must have happened is that the people who are creating Dune Part 2, the movie, they must be remaining faithful to the books. I personally would have changed it to make it a serious and impactful moment. But it really was just like a passing detail. That was the one thing I was disappointed in. So anyways, aside from that, that's really like one of the major spoilers. I know I did talk about like details in this movie. If you watched until this point and you haven't seen it yet, or maybe you have seen it, I hope you enjoyed it. Tell me what you think about it in the comments. At the end of the day, if you haven't seen it, I would highly encourage you to go see this movie. It was a 2.5-hour movie. It flew by. I'm probably gonna go see it again. I just enjoyed it so much that I want to talk about it. Yeah, bye.